Hey guys, Scott here. Today I wanted to go over an experiment I was doing over the past couple of days. Now, this whole thing started because I was doing Adept achievements and I was playing Bubba, and I remember saying a bunch of times as I was trying that, because it took a while, that I think it would be significantly easier to win if I had just no chainsaw whatsoever, but I actually had a really good slowdown build. And I said, in fact, I would win pretty much all of my matches if I just had a slowdown build and no power. And a lot of people in my chat said I was full of shit, so I planned out a day to prove them wrong, where I can still win most of my matches, not using my power, but having a really good build. But I wanted to go further than that. Instead of just being a spiteful thing, actually get some data out of it. So I decided to make a little experiment where I did a day of streaming just doing that. Then I had another full day of streaming. Actually, I split it into 2 days of doing the complete opposite, where I would only use my power and I would not bring a build or anything like that. And I wanted to compare the two to see if, one was harder than the other. And so for the actual games where I had no power but all slowdowns, I felt pretty safe most of my matches. Having Call of Brine, Interruption, Pain Resonance, whatever, all that stuff to fall back on, it's a nice safety net, and I felt way less stressed. I only had one match where everyone didn't die, and this was the match in the B-roll, because I wanted to show you why that was the case, because it was the most ridiculous Borgo I've ever seen. I think I kicked 17 pallets during the match, and there were still more, so I would chalk that up to the map itself. But for every other game, I felt pretty safe and relaxed. Like, I didn't feel like I was under pressure of losing, because having all those slowdowns is a really nice safety net. And that's why a lot of people run them, because that safety net feeling is really nice. You don't want to be constantly stressed when you're playing the game. So I completely understand that. So yeah, there was one game that I didn't kill everybody. I got 10 hooks and 2 kills, which is almost a perfect game, but not quite. The next day, and the next 2 days, actually, since I did shorter streams, but it's split in between two, I played Wesker without using any perks, but I was able to use his power as much as I want. Now, I picked Wesker because I wanted to pick a killer that has a very good power, but not overbearingly so. Because, yeah, probably Nurse and Blight's power are going to be better than the perks you bring, because it's Nurse and Blight. But I wanted to make a general statement on the game because, obviously most killers are not nearly as good as Nurse and Blight. So I wanted to pick Wesker because he's a good killer that has a very strong power, but not overbearingly so. And so the games where I was able to use Wesker's power to as, much effect as I wanted, I found those games harder. I lost more. I was way more stressed the entire time. And the reason I was so much more stressed is because I didn't have that slowdown to, have as a backup. The only slowdown you get when you have no slowdown perks is you downing players. So every single dash I made was 10 times more stressful, because if I missed it, it was so much more value that the survivors would get out of that miss. And since I didn't have the slowdowns to, fall back on, I was significantly more stressed the entire time I was playing, and it sucked. I hated it. Like, I wasn't even, enjoying myself, because every single game I was just sweating my ass off. Now, I did decide to play as I normally play because I didn't want to muddy the results at all. So I still played as I normally do. I still didn't do camping or tunneling, or I tried not to slug. Sometimes I had to do a little bit, but I tried to play as nice as I normally do, because I didn't want to impact the results. I would be able to skew it if I was losing, to play a bit sweatier, and then I could actually maybe make up for the time that I needed to be as constant as possible. So I wanted to play as I normally do. And yeah, I was still way more stressed out when I was not using a build, but I could use my power as much as I want. So what is a conclusion we can draw from this? It's not a very scientific experiment, so take all this with a grain of salt. But what this means, in my opinion, is that the build that you bring is more important than the killer you play, or how good you are at the killer that you play. For example, you can pick Bubba, and you can use his chainsaw as much as you want, but if you don't have the slowdowns for it, you might not have enough time to win, especially if you're playing nice and all that stuff. However, if you are playing Bubba and you don't have a power, you don't even have a chainsaw, you can just down one guy. And then once you've downed that one guy, if you have an entire build dedicating to face camping people, just bring them to the basement, sit there. They're going to die, because people are probably not going to try against a face camping Bubba. Even if you're not using your power, it doesn't matter. And so you can actually have the least skilled gameplay that you could possibly have, which is face camping someone to death, and still come out on top a lot of your matches, because the perks enable you to do that. And so I think your build is more important than your skill at the game, and it's more important than the killer that you bring. This goes both ways, by the way. It's kind of hard to do an equivalent because survivors don't have powers, for example, but I would make that equivalent to a 4-man Survive with Friends, if we were going to go that. Again, it's really hard to compare the two. But what does that actually mean? What conclusion do you draw from that statement, that powers are more, or that your build is more important than your skill at the game and your power? I think what that means is Dead by Daylight is currently too reliant on game-changing perks on both sides. And the question is, would the game be better if the overall value of perks was toned down drastically? Like every perk was toned down to the level of something like lightweight, for example, where it gives you value, but it's not game-changing. Or even like on the strong end, Corrupt Intervention. It's really good, but it's not going to single-handedly win you the game or anything like that. What if every perk had that level of impact on the match? What I think would happen is the game would be way more balanced. It would be way more skill-based. And that would make the game overall, much more fair to play. However, on the flip side, I think the game would be more boring. Because at the end of the day, most people don't really give a shit about getting better at Dead by Daylight. This is not really a game that super heavily rewards high investment into the game, and so most people just play it casually. And the devs have gone on record saying the reason there's so much map RNG and the perks are designed in the way that they are is because they want players that are of lesser skill to occasionally come out on top against better players, so they get that dopamine hit that the better players get way more often. This is something they've said. They've gone on record saying this. That's why RNG is such a very important component to the game, because they want to give that feeling to the casual player that they can still come out on top even if they don't necessarily deserve it. And so if we made all perks way less effective and way less impactful overall, we would have a scenario where the game, yes, is way more balanced and more skill-based, but I guarantee the player base would go down significantly because you're now removing all of those cool plays that can happen where you need a body block for a teammate and you can't, but unless you have Dead Hard right at the right time, and that's an exciting play, or the satisfaction of seeing 3 people get erupted and things like that. Those like dopamine hits would pretty much go away, and all we would have is the raw game of Dead by Daylight in which you would have to just be better to beat your opponent. Again, that would be way more fair and way more balanced, but I think overall it would damage the game because at the end of the day, people prefer a fun game, not a balanced game. Now, obviously, a fun and balanced game is ideal, but if you had to pick one of the other, people are going to choose fun over balance pretty much every single time, unless you're a comp player, in which case, why don't you play a game where you get rewarded for playing, competitively and stuff like that? So this is not the type of game to have that type of, game design be rewarded, in my opinion. So overall, the conclusion is that, yeah, your build is more important than your skill at the game, which I'm not really a fan of, but that's how the devs have designed the game. And that is, I think, why the game's player base is still fairly big, because most people are casual players, and having that varying levels of ridiculous balance with perks and things like that make it so even the weaker players can come out on top, and that's what the devs wanted. So I'm curious to hear you guys' takes on this. Like, what do you actually think would be better for the game? The actual balance of it or the actual fun of it? And it's a pretty, gray scenario, in my opinion. There's not really a right answer there. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think. But it is definitely not a great feeling to learn that people are getting carried by their builds more than their actual skill of the game on both sides. Again, that's not a very good feeling. But when you're using those perks, it's a great feeling. So I don't know, very complicated, but that was the end of the experiment. I just wanted to go over that. I found it pretty interesting. And there are still at least like 17 pallets left on this map. Thanks for watching.